you are automatically going to assume that the more expensive one is the higher quality one, and so you're actually more willing, if you're for high quality whiskey, to pay more money, even if you have even if it's not necessarily a good product, you're still going to end up paying for it. And that's what happened in the 80s with colleges. And again, so they started to raise their prices, and they were abetted by the student loan program, because all of a sudden, schools are raising their prices. How do students pay for those prices if tuition is rising faster than family income? Well, the loans filled that gap.
Wall Street Journal reporter Josh Mitchell. His book, The Debt Trap, in conversation with Anya Kamenetz of NPR.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and it's also probably worth noting that the economics of higher education are extremely complicated, right? Like they have other streams of even federal funding. They've got research funding. They have public funding of their public institutions. And so they're assembling all of these, and I think there's some theories that say that basically colleges raise all the money they can, and they spend all the money they raise.
Yes.
And then we're not even talking about for-profits. I mean, talk about what happened in the for-profit sector.
Totally. So, well, because you had these vouchers where students could use them anywhere they wanted, the public school system wasn't really keeping up with growth and the number of students. There were a lot of schools being built at this time to accommodate the fact that more and more people were entering college. But one thing happened that led to the rise of for-profit colleges. A lot of schools either weren't growing quickly enough to absorb these students, or they were, but they wanted to become more selective in who they allowed in.
Okay.
And so for-profit schools. I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
Oh, no, I just wanted to bring us some demographic into this, right? Like, so we're talking about 70s, 80s, you've got more women trying to go to college, you've got more members of racial minorities finishing high school and trying to go to college, you've got the job market changing, so more people need some college education, and 70s and 80s was a retrenchment in public spending, so these community colleges that have been growing, they're not growing fast enough for all of this to go.
Right, and also a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's really important here. The early 80s recession is really when the college wage premium opened up. I mean, it went like this, where you had the wages of college graduates shooting up, and the wages of non-graduates shooting down over the next 10 years.
It's because of Reagan's union busting, it's because of the decline in manufacturing, and it's because of the transition to the knowledge-based economy. So it's
Totally. I mean, if you think about all these tech companies, they started in the 80s.
Yeah.
And the early 80s recession itself, a lot of businesses had held off investment during that era of high inflation. As soon as Paul Volcker and the Fed conquered inflation and brought inflation down, businesses started to invest again in equipment and computer technology or what have you. And so these companies suddenly needed workers who were more skilled to operate this new tech. And yes, all the other factors that you just said were at play here as well. And so this is when demand for college graduates really went up and demand for non-graduates started going down, which meant there was go ahead.
Yeah, but like you just said, the public colleges don't necessarily want to open the doors to these newer, untested students, because what are they doing? They're climbing the prestige ladder, and they want to advertise that they have a better graduation rate and a lower acceptance rate, and so they're not necessarily making spots for these students.
Right, and same with private colleges. Private colleges actually were doing more of that. They were sort of the first ones to engage in this prestige game.
Yeah.
And so, so what ended up happening is that there were these for-profit colleges started to crop up, going after GI people with the GI Bill money, who vets who came back from the Vietnam War, who had GI Bill money as well as student loan money and grants. And so there were all these for-profit colleges that cropped up. Partly they wanted to, or in large part, a lot of them wanted to take advantage of all this money that the government was putting in the hands of students. But they also were serving a purpose in that if you are a blue-collar worker in the middle of the country and maybe you don't live near a public to your college, or you don't have any grades to get into a four-year college, or maybe you're 35 years old and you just don't have any higher education training whatsoever, but you want to go back and learn new skills. Well, these for-profit colleges started to sort of fill in some of the gaps that were left by the public system or the nonprofit system. And so just going back to the first GI Bill, for-profit colleges cropped up really quickly, and there was a big default crisis after that. This is after World War II. The same thing that happened in the 70s with the Vietnam War. The government expands its aid to veterans, and schools crop up. There was a for-profit crisis in the 80s. It was one of the most fascinating things I found in reporting this book is that a lot of the problems that we've seen over the past 15 years happened on a smaller scale in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s.
That is super interesting, right? So these colleges crop up. They're basically, they're taking advantage of the fire hose of money from the government. And what are some of their really predatory practices?
Well, there were these schools called correspondence schools. They're basically like online schools before online schools, where they would like mail you stuff to read and do homework on, and then they would charge a lot of money, and students they told students they would have a really good shot of getting a job afterwards, and then a lot of times the students couldn't find work, and then they would default on their loans. But again, the way Sallie Mae and the student loan program was set up, these schools really didn't suffer consequences when their students failed. And this is what I mean by the unintended consequences of this program is schools got to keep the money up front in a lot of cases. And students either were on the hook for that money or taxpayers were on the hook for that money. And so, but a lot of the problems that you hear about for-profit schools now were going on back then.
Yeah, and they have not been reined in because we haven't changed the fundamental structure.
Yeah, and you had asked a couple questions earlier that I think applies here, and I wanted to mention this. When you say colleges in general, whether it's for-profit colleges or state colleges or private colleges, have they have enough skin in the game? One of the things I discovered is before the government got into student lending, a lot of colleges themselves would make loans to their students.
Yeah.
And therefore, because it was the college's money, if the student defaulted, the college would have to eat those losses, or at least some of those losses.
It's a good alignment of incentives, right? Because if you want to provide a program that's giving value to your students and stand by your product.
Exactly. I've always asked college presidents this, if you're so confident in the product you're providing, then why do you need the government to give you so much loan money? Why don't you put up some of your own loan money, use some of your endowment money, and, lend to your students if you're so confident they're going to, come out and get a great job and, be really highly paid afterward, then, share some of that risk. And so they were doing that. There was this program, and it was the default rates were very low. And actually, one of the reasons why Congress agreed to create the very first loan program is because this official from the University of Minnesota, he told Congress, loans are a good investment for students because they default at very low rates. But again, I think that's because one of the reasons is that schools were on the hook if students defaulted on their loans. As soon as you take the risk off of schools of suffering any losses, I think that's when a lot of the programs started to arise.
Josh Mitchell, Wall Street Journal reporter, speaking with the education correspondent for NPR, Anya Kamenetz. His book, The Debt Trap.
I agree with you there, although a point that you also made that I think is really important to bring in here is that, college education is not just a financial investment, not just a financial instrument, but it's also a public good. And so when universities made personal decisions about who to lend to, didn't they oftentimes choose people that looked like perhaps the university administrators, right? People that came from good families that were white, perhaps male, right? And choosing lucrative specialties as well.
Yeah, this is the ultimate tension of any type of loan program like this. Yes, there was a private sector loan program before Lyndon Johnson's program was passed by Congress in 1965, and it was growing really quickly. But you had, for example, a dean from Howard University, a historically black college here in D.C., tell Congress, look, this program's great, except a lot of our students don't have access to it. You know, a lot of our black students just don't, banks aren't making them loans. And so while this program is serving a lot of people, it's not serving everyone, including some of the people that need loans the most. And so again, that was the big tension behind whether you have a program with underwriting standards or a program that restricts who can get loans versus this federal program where Lyndon Johnson said, wait a minute, let's have everyone who's everyone have access to a loan. And so we've never resolved that question, I think, or Congress has never resolved that question of at what point are you helping students versus harming students by giving them loans if you know that they're very likely to default on them. On the one hand, if you give everyone a loan, you are extending access. On the other hand, you are inevitably setting up a lot of families to default down the line. If you don't look at things like how able are they going to be able to repay this loan if it's $50,000 versus what their income is, that's been a tension throughout the whole history of this program.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And it also, I mean, it layers onto kind of, I mean, higher education in general, like who needs a credential to get their foot in the door versus who is someone that hiring managers will take a chance on. And so we've seen that, you know, women are really striving to achieve more and more higher education, but they're not seeing that pay off in pay, you know,